Good morning. We are ready to read chapter 31 of our book. Whew, we are getting there, friends. So remember they just planted the magic bean from Jack's grandfather's bag. We found out that Jack's father is Jack and the beanstalk, and he was the one who brought the giant down and killed Prince Philip's father, and Prince Philip's related to Sleeping Beauty because that was who he was supposed to be betrothed to. So it's all connecting. All right, so let's see if they can grow that magic bean into a beanstalk to get to Malevolent's castle. Chapter 31. It didn't take very long for the bean to take root in the sand below Malevolent's castle. It took even less time for the first sprout to break through the dirt with a loud pop, startling a nearby blackbird from its sleep. "Wow," May said as she bent over to stare at the sprout. "That was quick. How long do you think it'll—" A second sprout interrupted her, popping up right between her feet. "Whoops," she yelled, jumping backward. Jack and Philip both stepped back a few paces as well, giving the plant more room. That turned out to be a good thing, as 5 more sprouts immediately broke through the sand where the teenagers had just been standing. "How many shoots will it grow?" Philip asked suspiciously. The bean did not appear to be that large. 4 beans went all the way into the clouds, Jack said, eyeing the shoots. 1 bean should be plenty to get us up to the castle. "I'll never get used to this," May said, as the sprouts grew under the moonlight. "I mean, shouldn't it need sunlight? Magic?" As the first bean sprout grew larger, more and more popped up through the sand, each one inching up toward the sky. Proving it was only a matter of time, the first sprout tipped over and curled right into its neighbor. Without even pausing, the 2 sprouts spiraled around each other, then branched off together in a third direction. It didn't take the other sprouts long to push their way into the mix as well, and soon a relatively thick vine made up of dozens of smaller shoots rose into the sky. Other individual sprouts still grew on their own, but most seemed to gravitate toward the larger vine. "Maybe we should give it more room," Jack said nervously, glancing down at the ground beneath them. There was no telling what was forming underneath the sand and might burst out at any second. "It's not that big," May said, reaching out to touch a leaf on the larger vine as it rose quickly beyond her grasp. "Do you think we should grab on at some point?" she asked. "It'd save us the climb." "Perhaps we ought to wait until it has finished growing?" Philip asked nervously, looking a bit green himself as more and more shoots twisted and wrapped themselves around the larger vine, moving like a grotesque tentacles of some foul squid. "Why wait?" Jack said. "You're not scared of a little plant, are you, Philip?" He tossed a challenging look back at the nervous prince. Philip just glared at him. Jack smiled in response. "Fine, you wait down here," he said. "I'll go save Merryweather." Quickly checking to make sure his bag and sword were secure in his back, Jack readied himself, waved to Philip and May, then took a running jump straight at the vine. He slammed into the plant a bit harder than he would have liked, considering he was going for an impressively easy sort of look, but at least he managed to find a fairly secure shoot to grab a hold of before he lost his grip. Jack's feet kicked around for a brief moment before finding a shoot strong enough to stand on, but that was all he needed to hold himself up. By the time Jack secured himself and looked back down to the beach, he found himself 10 feet above May's and Philip's heads. "Come on," he shouted down to them. "You'll miss your ride." May shouted in excitement, then took a running leap onto the beanstalk as well, landing much more gracefully than Jack had. Philip hesitated, then took a deep breath and followed the princess. Jack noticed with more than a little annoyance that the prince landed on the rising vine absolutely perfectly, as if he did this sort of thing every day. "Should we have told the wolf what we're doing?" May shouted up to Jack. "I think he'll be able to figure it out," Jack yelled. He glanced down past May and Philip to see if he could locate the wolf from this height, but he was already higher than he'd thought and couldn't make out much on the ground in the dark. Suddenly, Jack felt dizzy, and for a brief moment he almost lost his grip. He quickly shook off the feeling and threw both arms around the vine, resolving not to look down again for the rest of the trip. Unfortunately, it wasn't looking much better, as Jack quickly realized. "Uh-oh," he shouted. "What?" said May. "I think we aimed badly," Jack shouted back. "Did we miss the castle?" Philip yelled up. "Oh, we're gonna hit it all right," Jack said with a wince. "Just hold on. Make sure you're secure down there." Without waiting for a response, Jack quickly followed his own advice, wrapping stray shoots around his arms and kicking his legs through some other loops. It wasn't much, but it was all he could do under the circumstances. Feeling a bit more secure, he glanced upward again. As they'd seen from the beach, the castle sat on an island in the sky, an island supported by a very narrow column in stone. That meant the sides of the island hung far out over the ocean and beach, nowhere close to the supportive stone column in the middle of the island. When planting the magic bean, they tried to aim for the very edge of the island's overhang, considering they would have to jump from the beanstalk to the castle. Unfortunately, aiming a magic beanstalk wasn't the easiest thing in the world to do. Instead of pulling up next to the overhang, it appeared as if the beanstalk was headed straight for it. As Jack watched with growing apprehension, the first roots reached the bottom of the overhang, pushing up into the rock. The shoots curled back over themselves when they couldn't move the stone. Fortunately, those first strands didn't have the support of the main shoot, which itself was about 2 seconds away from reaching the overhang. "Brace yourselves," Jack shouted down as the main beanstalk connected with the cliff. Instantly, the entire stalk shuddered, sickeningly, shaking and vibrating all over the place. Even worse, the shaking was soon followed by a rather horrifying cracking noise from the overhang. Small rocks began to tumble down all around Jack. He held onto the vine as tightly as he could, his eyes firmly closed as he desperately hoped that the beanstalk would just push up and around the overhang, leaving the rock intact. Instead, the overhang decided to kill Jack's hopes by cracking right in half with a sound like thunder. The shock of the break sent the beanstalk into brutal convulsions, shaking Jack right off the plant. As he tumbled backwards, his eyes opening wide in shock, he heard his heart pounded louder in his ears than the rock breaking above him. Fortunately, the loops around his legs held firm, and instead of falling completely off the beanstalk, Jack found himself suspended upside down over nothing. He quickly threw his hands back into the vine, grabbed the center stalk, and jerked himself back in, just as the broken half of the overhang plummeted down past him, right through the spot where his body had been seconds ago. Boy, they can't seem to catch a break, can they? As Jack's toes went numb at the thought of what had almost just happened, he managed to scream out a warning to May and Philip, knowing in his heart that he was already much too late. A second later, he heard the rock explode as it hit the sand below. "Are you kidding me with that?" May shouted up at him. "Could you maybe not drop anything else?" "To be fair, Jack was not at fault," Philip said in response. "Not this time, at least." "She knows that, idiot," Jack yelled down. "Stay close to the vine. It's not done." After the largest piece broke off, smaller but no less deadly bits of rocks tumbled down past Jack, each one falling with enough force to split his head open. The deadly rock shower soon slowed, then stopped completely, fortunately leaving him with nothing more than some bruises. The beanstalk, though, hadn't stopped growing and was pushing right up through the newly created edge of the overhang. As he rose toward it, Jack watched the rock carefully, making sure he knew exactly when to jump. "The edge of the island is on May's side, Philip," he yelled down. "Both of you watch out for it." As he said this, it occurred to him that he himself had to get to the other side of the beanstalk. Unfortunately, the thing was growing so fast he didn't have very much time to decide how exactly to do that. He threw a leg around to the other side of the beanstalk, quickly located a sprout that hopefully would support his weight, and stepped down. It held. He sighed, then moved his other leg around. The first step had taken him halfway around, but the overhang had just passed right by him. As he frantically searched for another foothold with his right foot, he watched the overhang fall away as the stalk continued growing. There really was no choice. Jack sighed, closed his eyes, and threw himself off the beanstalk. His fall ended with a shoulder-crunching landing on the overhang. The pain caused him to bite down hard on his lip, but overall he counted himself lucky. After all, if he had missed, it was a long way down, and frankly, he had already taken far too many falls from great heights in the past few days. Jack pushed himself to his feet just as May's head popped up past the edge of the overhang. She smiled as she rose up and easily stepped off the beanstalk onto the overhang. "That wasn't too bad," May said. Jack couldn't bring himself to return her grin as he felt around his body to see if anything had broken. A few seconds later, Philip rose up past the overhang, stepping off just as neatly as May did. "Quite a nice way to travel," the prince said, just as Jack shook his head and wondered what kind of supreme being would allow this sort of injustice. He started to say something, then noticed that Philip had frozen in place and was staring at something behind Jack. On his other side, May seemed to have seen the same thing. "Yup, that's just about our luck," she said quietly. Jack whipped his head around to see what she was talking about, then sighed deeply. 6 lumbering goblins covered in black armor strode toward them in the moonlight. All 6 held swords, easily as long as the goblins were, and all 6 swords were pointing at Jack, May, and Philip. Even as Jack frantically tried to come up with a plan, May clapped a hand on his shoulder. "I got this one," she said confidently. The princess stepped past him, then raised her hand, palm out. "Stop!" she roared. Immediately, the group of goblins stopped in their tracks. Jack stared at them in surprise for a second, then realized that the creatures most likely didn't know what May planned to use that hand for. After all, the goblins knew as well as anyone that palms could be awfully dangerous in the wrong hands, so to speak. If she was a witch or a magician of some kind, she might be casting a spell. What are you doing?" Jack whispered out of the side of his mouth. "Getting us inside," May responded in the same way. "Hear me, creepy little monster thingers," she shouted to the goblins. "Take us to your leader. Take us to Malevolent. We have important information for her." The goblins looked at one another, then smiled. One of the larger ones took a step forward. "Gladly," it said. "Well, good," May responded. "It's nice to finally meet some reasonable people here." "But first," the bigger goblin said, "we'll take you to the dungeon. You'll see Our Lady, all right, in a few hundred years." And then the goblins attacked. Ooh. And that is the end of chapter 31. So we'll have to see how they get out of this mess that they've gotten themselves into tomorrow. Bye, friends.